fantastic conference. It's a great honor to be here. This is my second time to Salt Lake City. As Lindsay mentioned, I'm preparing for my 20th anniversary this week, and we're going to Iceland. So I'm very focused on a bunch of different things. And as I was getting on the airplane last night, I realized I forgot the charger for my laptop. And this really sucks because I hadn't finished my presentation, and I have a whole bunch of work stuff I got to do today. And my battery on the laptop was almost dead. And it reminded me that when I was at Facebook, these issues didn't happen very often because anytime I traveled, if I went to the office, I didn't even have to go to the help desk if I forgot a charger or a cable or something. We had these things. We had these vending machines where all I'd have to do is badge in to the machine, and it would give me whatever it is that I needed, a memory stick, a keyboard, a mouse, whatever. And this was just one of the many ways that we sought to drive productivity for the workforce at Facebook. As Lindsay mentioned, that was my job. There's really only two things that make Facebook go: servers and people. We have a dedicated function that deals with nothing other than making the servers more productive and more efficient, and my job was the workforce. And as Lindsay mentioned, we accomplished a lot in my 6.5 years at Facebook. We more than 10x the workforce, and we well more than 20x the business through a whole bunch of productivity initiatives, which includes tools from my teams, but all the other things too. In fact, a big source of Facebook's productivity comes from its culture and its commitment to hiring world-class people and developing those people. And so I thought today I'd like to share a little bit of my learnings from how we drove productivity, including a conversation on something that's relevant in today's day and age, which is how do we incorporate things like artificial intelligence into the enterprise. But let me start with just a super quick background on who I am, so you understand who's talking to you. I started my career as a software engineer. I spent the first half of my career at companies like Sybase, Silicon Graphics, Portera Systems. But I also have a real passion for business. I've always loved books like Good to Great, and loved studying how do companies achieve exceptional business performance through leadership, technology, and other strategies. And it's through that that I came into IT, which is really the combination of both business and technology. And that led me to become the CIO of one of the best managed companies in the Silicon Valley, KLA-Tencor, and then eventually to Facebook. Now, I got to Facebook because I was pretty much the only CIO, or so I'm told, that was able to pass the technical interview that we had. I literally, when I got there, I had to draw ER diagrams and write SQL statements for a fictitious coupon application, which I hadn't done in over 10 years. But I worked at a database company for the first 5 years of my career, so this was actually pretty easy for me. But more importantly, I was really impressed by how much effort Facebook was putting into this interview. I had to meet with a ton of different people across sales, finance, HR, engineering, operations. It was really important to Facebook that I met their bar and that I would fit their culture. And my last interview was with Mark Zuckerberg himself. And I remember coming into the interview, I distinctly remember what we talked about. I was going in trying to understand, is this guy lucky or smart? Keep in mind, this is back in 2010. His first question of me was, what do I think of the company? And I said to Mark, I haven't seen anything like this since my days at SGI. You guys have an amazing culture. And he looked at me and he scratched his head and he's like, who's SGI? I forgot. The guy was 10 years old when I worked at that company. But what I did get out of this conversation is that Facebook is led by a smart, inspired, amazing leader with some innate abilities and a real thirst and passion for learning. And so out of this, I was sold, and fortunately for me, they were sold on me. So coming to Facebook, I found that my experience with culture in the interview was not just window dressing. This is how the company gets things done. Candidates are assessed based on how well they will adapt to the culture when they get there. And once you're a new hire, the first step of the process, your onboarding focuses heavily on teaching you the cultural memes and norms and how Facebook does stuff. For some roles, this can go on for weeks. You're surrounded at the company by posters like this that say, fail harder, move fast and break things. What would you do if you weren't afraid? These are all different memes around an idea, which is that failure is not something to be feared. Failure is actually core to Facebook's source of innovation. Failure is synonymous with learning. There's actually a very famous story of an intern who was working on a part of Facebook that is designed to keep it from breaking. And in the process of testing it, he took the entire site down. He didn't just take it down, it was hard down for several hours. It was the worst outage that Facebook had experienced to date. This is, again, back in 2010. And when all was said and done and people figured out what had happened, this guy wasn't fired. He wasn't even disciplined. He was celebrated. He went around talking to new hires and developers around the company, sharing with them his experience, what he learned from it, and how they could avoid becoming the guy who took Facebook down for 4 hours. This was how Facebook handles things through their culture. They don't need a bureaucracy to come up with rules to prevent problems from reoccurring. So this was the environment that I came into. And I thought, hey, maybe I can contribute. Maybe I can do something new and innovative. And that's why we started with things like the vending machines that I talked about. We blanketed the company with video conferencing. And we brought software engineering into the IT organization. Why did we do that? We were seeking to drive that next wave of productivity, and we were struggling with some of the technologies that we could buy at the time. It felt for a lot of things, like for CRM technologies, for example, that the technology was designed for the buyer and not for the user. I mean, if you think about for CRM, who is the buyer? It's usually the VP of sales. And what do they care about? They usually care about things like, what's going on in the funnel, in the sales funnel, and forecast accuracy and stuff like that. Well, what does that mean for the sales rep? It usually means more work, more things that they have to update so that they can make the system work to keep that person informed. And we had a different thesis for a CRM that we wanted to build, which is how do we use this technology to help the salesperson get more done and accomplish the problem that way? So we built Facebook CRM, and we achieved a dramatic increase in sales productivity through that. And we did this again and again across all of the major business functions of the company. And with time, that led us to more ambitious pursuits. We looked at things like machine learning and natural language processing and image processing. How can we use these technologies? How can we bring this kind of AI into the enterprise? And this is where I'd like to spend the rest of my time today to get a little bit deeper on. But let me start with expectations. I Googled artificial intelligence in preparation for this speech, and I was amazed at what I got back. When you read the articles that come up, it's all about how machines are going to destroy jobs, how they're going to take over all of these things, from driving cabs around to the legal profession. It feels as if we are just on the cusp of the singularity. But we've heard this before. In fact, if you go back in history, the first paper published on artificial intelligence by Alan Turing was back in 1950. That was 60 years ago. And since then, there have been multiple periods where expectations have gotten well ahead of the reality. The technology that we're currently celebrating today as part of AI is actually not that new. In some cases, it's decades old. It's more viable. Yet, because of the evolution of technology, we are seeing a lot more of this. We are seeing things like Siri and Alexa, facial recognition, which is starting to get close to, and in some cases to surpass, the capability of humans. We have hundreds and thousands of vehicles on the road which have some self-driving capability, and that's only going to increase. Now, back in 2012, Facebook was already neck deep in these technologies. We were heavily invested with AI. And I'll just use a simple example that's easy to understand. If you think about a newspaper, one of the most important roles within a newspaper is the editorial staff. They are responsible for sifting through all the stories, figuring out what goes on the headline of the newspaper, figuring out what the sequence of stories are going to be. And what essentially Facebook Newsfeed is a personalized editorial staff for you. It looks at all the hundreds of stories that your friends are posting, and it, as well as companies you might be connected to, and it figures out what's going to be the most interesting content to drive your engagement. And it's really successful in this, in driving lots and lots of engagement. And now, in today's world, people use Facebook on average almost an hour a day, and there's more than 2 billion people that are using the product. Now, When we started looking at leveraging some of this AI technology in our internal environments, we initially focused on things that were very close to the product. We built models in my team to help describe audiences on Facebook. We had a function called Audience Insights that would literally spend hours and hours trying to answer the questions of advertisers. What are millennials talking about? What is going on with new mothers? What is going on with the people who are retiring? The Audience Insights team would go and analyze usage patterns on Facebook to provide these answers. And so we built some products, internal products, that leveraging a bunch of machine learning would figure this stuff out automatically. And this stuff is really successful in making the Audience Insights team scalable. So successful that we're actually able to give it to our sales organization. And for our sales teams, this was so successful in both driving incremental revenue and saving some of their time that their customers got really impressed with this. And so eventually we productized these things. And that's where things like Audience Insights and Facebook topic data came from. But we wanted to go further. Like, what other roles could we apply this kinds of technology into? So we had to break the problem down a little bit. If we look at the human versus the machine, there's some really interesting comparisons between the two. Machines are obviously really good at handling repetition, doing things over and over and over again. Humans, on the other hand, are really good with ambiguity. They don't have a problem facing a new circumstance. They usually figure it out. They're very creative. Machines are easily confused. On the other hand, humans are easily fatigued. And a third thing, which is not necessarily good or bad, but humans are very emotional. We're emotionally driven. Machines are kind of emotionless. So when you think about it, it doesn't really feel like these two things would be very interchangeable. And if we look at some history, let's just take example, pilots. Why do we still have pilots? Does anybody know what this is? This is a Hawker Siddeley Trident. And what is it doing? This is the first landing of a commercial airliner by a machine. And this was done in 1965. Since this event, pretty much every airline that's ever been produced has this technology in it. And so when you think about the progress in aviation from 1915 to 1965, how humans were in 1915 were just barely crawling into airplanes, and by 1965, they're flying in these monstrous machines that can land themselves. You'd think that given another 50 years, we would get rid of the pilot, especially since the number one cause of crashes in most aviation accidents is pilot error. So why do we still have pilots? Because machines can't do this. They can't understand how to handle something when it is outside of their original design. They can't creatively come up with a solution or evaluate risk when there's a whole bunch of variables, or consider the emotional impact of the consequences of their decisions. Now, I'm not saying that they will never be able to do this. I don't really know that. I just know that they can't do that today. So what does that mean? Does that mean this AI stuff is just kind of a boondoggle and that there's really no application for it? No, not at all. What is changing is the interface between human and machine. It's getting more fuzzy, and it's starting to shift based on these technologies. So with this, how can we apply this in the enterprise context? Maybe we should go create a bunch of bots to replace the help desk, or create machine-based virtual assistants. Well, we learned through many failures at Facebook that despite our ambitions to accomplish that, it's actually really hard. There's a whole bunch of design issues that get in the way. The first is that computers are actually kind of unreliable. They're reliably unreliable. You in many cases can predict how frequently they're going to fail, but they're not perfect. And so the lesson from this is the more that the machines get into these ambiguous states, the higher the percentage of failures that they're making, and you have to consider that in your designs. Second is that humans are consistently inconsistent. We don't like to do the same thing over and over and over again. Our performance will go down if we're asked to repeatedly do the exact same task over and over and over again. What that means when we're interfacing with machines is that we like to do it in lots of different ways, and the machine should be able to accommodate that variation. But the third one is big. This one's really hard. There's a whole bunch of context that we totally take for granted. I mean, you think about when we have a conversation with each other, we completely understand like how to, when is it appropriate to change the subject? When is it, how to be polite in that conversation? When I'm talking to Alexa or Siri, they can't even remember what I said one sentence ago. The machine has a lot of trouble with context. Another great example of this is if you get in natural language processing, machines really struggle with the understanding of the language around time. Humans often interact with time in relative terms. They'll say, hey, let's get together next week, or after I get back from vacation. The problem with this is that the context of what does it mean when I say get together next week, are we talking about the morning, lunch, or the afternoon, is implied. It's understood based on the relationship of the people that are having this conversation. When am I going to be going on vacation? That's understood based on a previous aspect of that conversation. And machines really struggle to capture and track and manage this thing because there's so many different permutations. The last thing, and this is also really important, is that the more machines act like humans, the more we expect them to behave and feel like us. And when they don't, we get angry at them. It creates an emotional reaction within us. So it means that when we're looking at trying to apply this technology, we don't just want to look at how to replace a job function. We want to look more at specific job activities. Now, the first two things on this slide are pretty obvious. Like scale and repetition, that's what machines are good at, so let's have them do it. But the third is, when we have machines focus on things that are mostly deterministic, with clearer decision criteria, they tend to do a better job. A simple example is like finding fraudulent transactions for a bank, or the alternative being like, can we have a machine write poetry? Fraudulent transactions, it's pretty easy to understand what is a fraudulent transaction, even if there's not a perfect definition of one. Writing poetry, I don't even know what good poetry is, so much more difficult to teach a machine that. This next thing is also really important. The cost of being wrong needs to be low. You take the example of Facebook News Feed. If the machine makes a bad choice on what story to put in front of you on the news feed, it's not a big deal. You just scroll right away. The cost there is almost infinitesimally small. And the last thing is that we should put machines into activities that don't really require a lot of emotion, particularly empathy. So let's look at this for some specific job functions. One of the functions that there's a lot of emphasis around is customer service. It's expensive, it's time-consuming, sometimes these jobs are not particularly fun, so how do we get more people out of customer service and get the machines to do it? And we tried this at Facebook. We actually built an algorithm that would front-end our help desk, so you could mail it, and it would read your email, and it would automatically figure out, based on a bunch of different things, not only what was in that email, but also who else what things you had on your machine, and it would try to guess what your problem was. And it would route you to the right place, and in some cases, it could even resolve the issue for you. And it could do this actually 85% of the time accurately. But we never deployed it. And the reason is, well, first, the 15% that it was wrong was really, really expensive. We would route tickets to teams that it did not belong in, and so we would have to distract them to make sure that ticket then got to the right place. More importantly, the human on the other side is getting frustrated, and there's no empathy in this process. There's nothing that was making the human feel better about this fact. Now, does that mean that you can't use AI in a customer service application? Absolutely not. But in this case, it made sense to put it behind humans as opposed to in front of humans. So when we took the exact same technology and we gave it to our help desk technicians, it meant that when you walked into the help desk, we already had some good predictions on what problems you might be having. And it made that help desk technician look really, really smart. Another example here is sales operations. So the data that Facebook manages about its customers is really voluminous, and it actually is quite difficult for Facebook to keep track of how much does a company like Coca-Cola spend with it, because Coca-Cola doesn't always buy directly from Facebook. It will buy through an agency or sometimes through a marketplace. So we used to have salespeople go around and search for these advertising accounts that were created on behalf of Coca-Cola so that they could keep track of the revenue that Coca-Cola has so they could get the appropriate commission. Giant waste of time, huge example of a job function that had a lot of scale and a lot of repetition. And so we built an algorithm to go do this for the salespeople. Now, the upside of this and what worked really, really well is that if the algorithm made mistakes, it really wasn't that big of a deal. We still had a sales ops team that could go off and correct that in the 5% of time that it did something wrong. But this saved overall thousands and thousands of hours of people's time. And I could keep going with different examples of where this technology can be applied if you think about exactly where it should be based on different designs. However, after doing this at Facebook for a better part of the last 4 years, it started to become clear to me that a whole new world of possibilities was opening up. And so I made the decision that it was time for me to be willing to fail and to go leave the company and to go create something brand new. And unfortunately, I'm running out of time, so I'm not going to be able to tell you about it today. But I'll tease you with the idea that we're working on something that will change how you relate to one of the most heavily used information systems in the enterprise using some of these techniques. But alas, I have to save that for next time. I hope you enjoyed this brief foray into Facebook, AI, and the next generation of work, and I thank you for your attention.